37th Congress, Senate. 2C. Session 272, in Senate of the United States. The 28th of April, 1842. Ordered to be printed. To accompany Bill H.R. 90. Mr. Wright made the following report. The Committee of Claims, to whom has been referred the bill from the House, entitled, An Act for the Relief of James Tongue, John Scrivener, and the legal representatives of William Hodson, deceased, report, that the bill provides for 3 distinct and several claims for buildings alleged to have been destroyed by the enemy, during the War of 1812-15, on a small creek emptying into the Chesapeake Bay, in the state of Maryland, and, as is inferred from the papers, in the county of Anne Arundel, in that state. The claim of James Tongue, first named in the bill, is for a storehouse, used for the storage, and inspection, and shipment of tobacco, situate upon the creek aforesaid, at a place called Tracy's Landing. That of John Scrivener is for a dwelling house, and the outhouses attached and appurtenant, but not separately valued, as particularly enumerated and described, situate at the mouth of the creek, at a place called Town Point, and somewhere from 1/4 to 3/4 of a mile from the tobacco warehouse. And that of the legal representatives of William Hodson, deceased, is for a dwelling house, store, windmill, and some outbuildings, not particularly enumerated, situate at Town Point, and within some 50 or 60 yards of the buildings claimed by Scrivener. The bill appropriates to Tongue $1,837.78, to Scrivener the sum of $3,840, and to the legal representatives of Hodson the sum of $3,968.39, making the whole sum appropriated by the bill, to pay the 3 claims, $9,646.17. These claims are all presented, and pressed, as coming within the principles established by Congress, in the 9th section of the Act of the 9th of April, 1816, and the 1st section of the Act of the 3d of March, 1817, declaring in what cases buildings, the private property of a citizen, destroyed by the common enemy, should be paid for out of the public treasury. That the principles which were established by these provisions of law may be clearly seen, and fully understood, the provisions themselves will be copied. The 9th section of the Act of the 9th of July, 1816, is in the following words, Sector 9. And be it further enacted, that any person, who, in the time aforesaid, has sustained damage by the destruction of his or her house or building by the enemy, while the said was occupied as a military depositee under the authority of an officer or agent of the United States, shall be allowed and paid the amount of such damage, provided it shall appear that such occupation is the cause of its destruction. T.J.H. Who's Alton, Print. 272. To the 1st section of the Act of the 3d of March, 1817, is in the following language, viz., USEC. 1. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that the 9th section of the Act entitled, An Act authorizing the payment for property lost, captured, or destroyed, by the enemy, while in the military service of the United States, and for other purposes passed on the 9th of April, 1816, being the section above copied, shall be construed to extend only to houses, or other buildings, occupied by an order of an officer or agent of the United States, as a place of deposit for military or naval stores, or as barracks for the military forces of the United States, and that in acting on all claims arising under the aforesaid 9th section, as well those whereon commissions are now returned, and remain undecided, as those on which commissions may be hereafter executed, it shall be the duty of the commissioner appointed in virtue of the act aforesaid, carefully to examine and investigate the same, and to report the facts in such case to Congress, as soon as may be, that such provision may be made for the relief of the respective claimants as shall be deemed just and proper. Such is the law, and such are the principles, under which the claims proposed to be provided for in this bill are prosecuted. The lapse of time since this legislation by Congress, and since the general consideration of the claims which arose under it, will be an apology to the committee for reminding the Senate that the Act of the 9th of April, 1816, provided for the appointment of one general commissioner, to examine and decide upon all the claims to arise under that Act, and that the awards of that commissioner, when in favor of the claim, were to be paid at the Treasury, but, where the claim exceeded $200 in amount, it was made the duty of the commissioner to appoint discreet persons, residing in the vicinity of the witnesses in the case, to take the testimony upon interrogatories to be prepared by the commissioner, and to return that testimony to him. It must be inferred, from the language of the last part of the first section of the Act of the 3d of March, 1817, above copied, that commissions to take testimony had been issued under the Act of 1816, in some cases, and that those commissions had been, in some cases, returned before the passage of the Act of 1817, but that no final decision of the General Commissioner had been made, upon any claim, at that time. Hence, any change of the principles upon which these claims for buildings damaged or destroyed were to be allowed, if a change was in fact made by the Act of 1817, was directed to be applied to all the claims, as well those upon which the testimony had been taken, as those upon which it had not, or which had not then been even presented. These remarks are made to show that there has not been, at any time, different general rules of allowance in relation to any of these claims, but that the Act of 1817 came in before any allowances had been made. It may be further remarked, here, that this first section of the Act of 1817 made one very essential change in the Act of 1816, so far as this class of claimants were concerned, viz., to take from the General Commissioner copyright symbol power to act finally upon the claims, and order their payment at the Treasury, and to make it his duty merely to report the facts to Congress. The 15 LH section of the Act of the 9th of July, 1816, limited the time for the 272 presentation of all claims under it to the period of 2 years from the day of the passage of the Act. Here the legislation remained until the 20th of April, 1818, on which day an act was passed, transferring all the remaining duties of the General Commissioner, appointed under the Act of 1816, to the third auditor of the Treasury, but expressly declaring that the last named officer should be governed by the same principles and rules, in the allowance of the claims, which had been prescribed to the Commissioner, whose duties he was to assume. So far no claims of this class had been allowed and paid, unless by the special action of Congress upon each claim, and so these claims remained until the 3d day of March, 1825. On the last named day an act was passed, directing the third auditor of the Treasury to take up all the cases which had been submitted to the Commissioner of Claims, appointed under the Act of the 9th of April, 1816, within the 2 years allowed for the presentation of claims under that Act, and which had not been previously allowed and paid, or definitively rejected, to take new testimony, if he should think it necessary, and to make awards in the cases so submitted to him. This Act allowed the claimants 9 months after its passage to make their presentments to the third auditor, and contained an appropriation for the payment of his awards, provided the whole amount should not exceed $250,000. Document number 36, of the Senate documents of the 2D session of the 19th Congress, sent to the Senate on the 25th day of January, 1827, by the third auditor, exhibits the results of the action of that officer under the last named Act of the 3d of March, 1825. It will show that 207 claims for damage or destruction of buildings were submitted to him under the Act, and that favorable awards for a greater or less amount were made in 114 of the cases. This completes a brief history of this class of claims, as connected with the legislation of Congress, separated from that private legislation upon individual claims, which has occupied more or less of the attention of every Congress from the close of the war to the present day, and from which the time of the committee will not permit them to attempt to extract general principles of allowance, as applicable to any class, if indeed such principles are to be extracted from that very uncertain action of the national legislature. The great mass of the claims of the class now under consideration, both as to number and amount, have been settled under the general legislation above reviewed, and in conformity with the principles it establishes, and whether the committee consider their duty to the claimants as a body, and entitled to a uniform rule of compensation for these losses, or to the treasury of the country, it seems to them perfectly clear that their rule of action should be the general legislation, and the allowances under it, unless they would unsettle every case of a claim which has been yet settled under these laws, and by taking the most liberal and latitudinous private law which has been passed as the settled rule, and established precedent, invite all those in whose favor partial awards have been made, to come again to Congress for a further allowance. This they are not disposed to do upon principle, and certainly the present state of the national treasury does not invite to that course. Hence, they have come to the conclusion to rest their action upon all these classes of old war claims, for property lost, captured, or destroyed by the enemy upon the principles embodied in the general legislation of the period when the claims were most fresh, most pressing, and could be most easily investigated, and their justice made known, and upon v/hitch principles the great mass FQ 272 for them were finally settled and compensated. What, then, were those principles, as applicable to buildings destroyed by the enemy, which are the claims now before the committee? They were, 1. That the building must have been in the actual occupancy of the United States. 2. That it must have been so occupied as a place of deposit for military or naval stores. 3. Or as barracks for the military forces of the United States. 4. The occupancy must have been by an order of an officer or agent of the United States. 5. The occupancy must have continued to the time of the destruction. 6. It must appear that such occupation was the cause of its destruction. The claims provided for in the bill before the committee have been combined and acted upon together by the various committees of the House of Representatives, because they are said to rest substantially upon the same testimony, and to possess the same degree of merit. This the committee believe to be true as to the merits of the respective claims, and the evidence tendered in their support is identically the same to an almost entire extent. A single circumstance, however, is much relied upon to support them all, which, if it have any strength, as the committee think it has not, can clearly inure to the benefit of the claim of James Tongue alone, for the tobacco warehouse. The three claims will, therefore, be considered together, in trying their merits by the principles above laid down, with the exception of the circumstance alluded to as applicable to the particular claim, and that will be noticed under the proper head. Were these buildings in the actual occupancy of the United States for any purpose? The committee think not, at or near the time of their destruction, and, with the exception of the tobacco warehouse, never. The proof is that the persons who occupied them, if they were occupied for military purposes, were officers and soldiers of the militia of the state of Maryland, acting without formal orders, or by the authority, and under the orders of the governor and other military officers of the state, and not by virtue of any call into the service of the United States. This, as well as the purposes of the military occupancy, is made perfectly clear from the petition itself, as well as from various parts all the testimony, as the following extracts will show. On pages 1 and 2 of the printed petition presented to Congress in F 841, in which all the claimants unite. They speak of the predatory character of the war prosecuted by the enemy, on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, in the year 1814, and of the embarrassments of the general government in its credit. Money, men, and means, to prosecute the war and extend protection and defense to the exposed portions of the country, and say, under these trying circumstances, it was in vain for our part of the country to look for or expect anything like an adequate protection from the general government. Our dwellings threatened with conflagration, our tobacco and our stock taken and carried off, our crops necessarily neglected or destroyed, many private dwellings, farms, crops, and all, deserted and left to the mercy of the enemy. From this language it will be seen that the petitioners do not themselves assume that the defense attempted at the points in question was conducted under the authority of the United States, but that they had ceased to depend 272 upon this government for protection, in consequence of its want of men and means to furnish it. This is more clearly shown by the affidavit of Walter Wyville, one of the witnesses examined on the part of the petitioners to substantiate these claims. The witness states that he acted as a sergeant in the company commanded by Captain Thomas T. Simmons, in the 2nd Regiment of Maryland Militia, and that his company with several other companies were ordered out by the Governor of Maryland to repel and keep off the enemy, and that, more effectually to prevent the invasion of the British, many of the officers of the 2nd Regiment of Maryland Militia selected a committee to wait on Governor Winder to let them have some pieces of cannon for the defense of Tracy's Landing warehouse, in which was deposited several hundred hogsheads of tobacco belonging to the tobacco planters, as it was believed this property would be in danger of being destroyed by the British, as Commodore Barney used the said tobacco warehouse as a depot for some of the military stores and munitions of war belonging to the United States flotilla. This deponent deposes and says he was one of the committee who did wait on the Governor of Maryland, and that the Governor did send to said regiment a piece of artillery, with a good supply of ammunition, which said artillery was placed at Town Point and C. All the testimony in the case confirms that given by this witness, that all the military force at Town Point or Tracy's Landing at or near the time of the attack of the enemy and the destruction of these buildings was a militia force, part of this 2nd Regiment, and acting exclusively under state authority, so far as they acted under regular authority at all. No orders to call these troops into service are presented or referred to, except very vague statements of the witnesses, such as that given above in the testimony of the witness Wyville, and such as the following. William Ennis, a witness, testifies. This deponent says he heard Captain Franklin say he was ordered out to Tracy's Landing by the Governor, that the orders came through their field officers, General Williams, Colonel Samuel Watkins, and Major Gassaway Watkins, all now dead. Portions of these companies are spoken of as having been at various periods at these 2 points, to wit, Town Point and Tracy's Landing, viz., the companies of the 2nd Regiment of Maryland Militia, commanded by Captains Simmons, Franklin, and Tillard. This committee in the year 1840, when these claims were before it, made inquiry at the office of the 3rd Auditor of the Treasury as to the claims generally, and especially as to any evidence of service rendered by these several companies at the period in question. The reply of that officer to all the inquiries of the committee was appended to their report, and is to be found printed, as part of document number 350 of the Senate documents of the first session of the 26th Congress. The information given by the auditor upon this point is to be found upon pages 11 and 12 of that document, and is, in substance, that, in examining the AC counts of the state of Maryland against the United States, growing out of the transactions of the war, he finds rolls showing that the company of Captain Simmons, or fractions of it, were in service on various occasions during the year 1814, for 1 or 2 clays at a time, but not at the time of the destruction of these buildings. That the company of Captain Tillard appears from the roll to have entered on duty on the 20th of October, 1814. That the company, officers included, appears to have consisted of 30 persons, and that but 14 of the number appear to have remained in service longer than 6 days, while of the 14 none remained in service T272, 6 longer than 11 days, and that the roll does not show when the duty was performed. That the roll of Captain Franklin's company shows that it was ordered on service by His Excellency the Governor on the 27th of October, 1814, and that the members of the company were presented as entitled to pay for from 2 to 10 days each. Upon this roll, in the column of remarks is an entry in these words, "Stationed near Tracy's Landing." This is all the evidence to be found in the office of the third auditor to FCAO the fact of the service, or the character of the service of the troops whose occupancy of these buildings for military purposes is made the foundation for these claims, and this evidence proves of record that the troops were in the service of the state, and not of the United States, so far as they /veer in service at all under orders. These portions of the testimony in the case are referred to principally to establish the single point that the service was state service, and that the authority exercised, whatever it might have been, was state authority, and not that of the United States. Hence any order for the occupation of the buildings, if any such was given, which does not appear, must have been an order from an officer or agent of the state of Maryland, and not an order of an officer or agent of the United States, and the occupancy, so far as the service of these troops and their occupancy was concerned, must have been an occupancy by the state, and not by the United States. As this is the great point upon which the fate of the bill before the committee must turn, and as they do not find it distinctly presented in any of the former reports upon these claims, although it is clearly suggested in the report of the third auditor, before referred to, and has been acted upon by that officer in all his awards upon claims of this character, the committee trust they will be excused for making a single other quotation from the printed petition of all the claimants, before referred to show what the real character of the service was performed by the troops by whom this military occupation of the buildings in question is relied upon. The extract is to be found upon page 5 of that petition, and is in the following words: "Again, it may be necessary to remark, when the enemy, from the position of their ships and movements of their barges and smaller craft, did not threaten an immediate landing, the men took it by turns to go home to work on their farms to try to procure bread and cultivate their crops, and do all they could to support their families in the spare time allotted to them on leave of absence." This statement is perfectly compatible with the state service of the militia of a particular district, charged with the defense of a specified point, and acting for the protection of the particular interests of their immediate neighborhood, of themselves, their families, and their property, such as the proofs in this case induce the committee to believe was the service of the militia of the state of Maryland, who at any time occupied the positions at Town Point and Tracy's Landing in the year 1814. Such service, however, while it would most satisfactorily account for the state of the rolls of the companies found in the office of the third auditor, would be wholly and entirely incompatible with any service in the military forces of the United States as authorized at that period. The committee feel compelled, therefore, to answer this first question in the negative, that the buildings were not, as far as the examination has yet proceeded, in the occupancy of the United States for any purpose. This conclusion might well be held to dispose of all the claims, and Sue 7/272, perceived the necessity of a farther inquiry, but, as the testimony presented requires the examination of the next point, and as they feel disposed to make their report full as to the whole question, they will proceed to touch upon all the remaining requisites to an establishment of the claims upon the settled principles they have taken for their guide. 2. Were these buildings occupied as a place of deposit for military or naval stores of the United States? Under this head the exception is reached, to which the committee have before referred, as to the occupancy of the tobacco warehouse as a place of deposit for naval stores. Almost all the witnesses refer to such an occupancy of this single building, under the orders of Commodore Barney, as a place of deposit for the munitions and stores of his naval flotilla upon the Chesapeake Bay, and they all concur in stating that the occupancy of the storehouse for this property of the United States commenced in the spring or early part of the summer of the year 1814, and continued until the middle or last of the summer of the same year. It further appears that a purser's steward and some of the witnesses say, a small guard also were kept in charge of these naval stores at the tobacco warehouse at Tracy's Landing, until they were substantially withdrawn from that depot, and either taken to the flotilla for consumption, or to Calvert County Courthouse, to be near the flotilla and convenient for its use. Here dates became of some importance, and yet they are not ascertained with much precision from the testimony in the case. All the witnesses who speak upon the subject say that the destruction of the buildings took place in the month of October, but none of them name the precise day of that month. In the report of Third Auditor, before referred to, a reference is made to Niles' Weekly Register for this date, and the register gives the day on which the British took possession as the 27th of October, 1814. In the absence of any other testimony, as to the precise date, and of any contradiction of its statement, the committee feel authorized to assume that made by the register as the correct date of the capture. There is not a little discrepancy in the testimony as to whether the destruction of the buildings took place on that day, or some days subsequent, and whether the buildings at Town Point were destroyed at the same time with the tobacco warehouse, or whether they were destroyed at the time of the capture, and the warehouse at the time of the retirement of the enemy on board of his fleet. The testimony seems to be clear, that the enemy remained in possession of the landing for some days, that his business was transporting the captured tobacco to his fleet, and that he occupied various houses in the vicinity of the storehouse during the time, and posted his men to prevent burning them, when the storehouse was burnt. Yet some of the witnesses state that all the buildings were in a state of conflagration at the same time, and others, that the buildings at the point were immediately fired upon the landing of the enemy. These discrepancies are not at all material to the consideration of the case which the committee take, and yet they have felt it to be their duty to refer to them, as evincing the uncertainty of testimony taken at a distance of more than 20 years from the time of the transactions, and resting merely in memory in the meantime. The committee have taken pains to trace the flotilla of Commodore Barney so far as to enable them to form an opinion how long his stores could have remained at Tracy's Landing, so as to make the tobacco warehouse within the spirit, or language, of the legislation of Congress, a place of 272.8 deposit for naval stores of the United States. They find that the Commodore, with his whole flotilla, was driven into the Patuxent, by the superior force of the enemy, in the month of July, 1814, that every effort in the power of the government, and of the state of Maryland, was made to protect the flotilla then, that troops of the United States, and militia of the state, were concentrated upon the point, calling for all the ammunition, provisions, and munitions of war, which could be brought to their aid, and that, on the 22d of August, 1814, in despair of protecting it longer, the whole fleet was, in pursuance of an order of the Commodore, set fire to and abandoned, and totally destroyed. It would be difficult for the committee to believe, under any circumstances, that, for more than 2 months after this total destruction of the flotilla, a depot of naval stores for its use was preserved at Tracy's Landing, and they do not think the testimony in the case was intended to produce this impression. The statements in nearly all the depositions are very full as to the occupancy of the tobacco warehouse as a naval depot, by the orders of Commodore Barney, but none of them state the continuance of that occupancy beyond the summer of 1814, and all that is found in the papers authorizing the inference of a continued occupancy as a depot for naval stores may be exemplified by a short extract from the printed petition of all the claimants, before repeatedly referred to. The extract is found upon page 2 of me petition, and is in the following words, viz., a part of which military stores were found in said warehouse when the British took it from the militia, in October, 1814, and were exultingly carried on board the Dragon 74. Many of the witnesses state that a part of the naval stores were said to have remained in the warehouse at the time of its capture and destruction, but none of them particularize what remained, while the whole testimony shows that there was no United States Guard there, nor any agent to see to the public property so left in the warehouse, if indeed any was in fact so left. The printed petition of the claimant, James Tongue, presented to Congress in June, 1838, upon page 4, contains the only particular statement upon this point found among the papers. That statement is in these words: a small parcel of cannonball and grape shot was left in said warehouse, and found there by the British officers when the enemy took possession of it. No one, the committee feels sure, will contend that a few balls and shot left in this tobacco warehouse, perhaps by accident, and perhaps because the teams sent to remove the last of the naval stores were fully loaded, and could not well take them, were to constitute that storehouse, within the meaning of the Acts of Congress, a place of deposit for naval stores for a period of more than 2 months after the shot and balls so left had been abandoned by the officers of the United States. After the military guard had been entirely withdrawn, and after the naval flotilla, for whose use the balls and shot had been provided and placed in that storehouse, had been entirely destroyed by fire, by the order of the officer commanding it. They, therefore, think the answer to this second question irresistible, that the tobacco warehouse, at Tracy's Landing, was not, at the time of the capture and destruction of that building by the enemy, on or about the 27th of October, 1814, and had not been for more than 2 months previously thereto, a place of deposit for naval stores of the United States within the meaning of the first section of the Act of the 3d of March, 1817. There is no pretense that naval stores were, at any time, deposited in any of the buildings at Town Point, or that any of those buildings had been *9. 272, at any time, used for any purpose by or for the flotilla, or by the order of Commodore Barney. Nor is it pretended that military stores of any description were, at any time, deposited in any of these buildings, other than such arms, munitions of war, provisions, and the like, as the militia of the state of Maryland may have placed in them, during their occupancy in the manner before mentioned, and which will be hereafter more fully described, their use of the buildings being claimed to be, not for storage, but for barracks. It certainly will not be claimed that such a use, by such troops, constituted the buildings places of deposit for military stores of the United States. The entire second inquiry, therefore, must receive a negative answer, as far as these claims are concerned. 3. Were these buildings occupied as barracks for the military forces of the United States? 1. This inquiry is answered in the answer to the first, as it has been shown, in discussing that point, that the United States had no military forces at the point at the time, that the troops which did, in fact, occupy the buildings were the militia of the state of Maryland, called into service by the authorities of the state of Maryland, if called into service at all, and acting under the orders of the military officers of the state of Maryland, so far as they were acting in conformity to regular orders at all. It seems impossible, then, that, within the meaning of this law, they can be called the military forces of the United States. The construction put by the committee upon the 9th section of the Act of 1816, as modified by the 1st section of the Act of 1817, both of which are before copied, is, that the occupancy must either have been for the storage of naval or military stores, the property of the United States, or for barracks for the military forces in the actual service of the United States, and that an occupancy of any other character does not come within the principles established by these laws. If the United States had taken possession of the building of a citizen for either of these uses, and had thus made it the legitimate object of capture and destruction by an enemy, according to the rules of civilized warfare, and if, while thus occupied and used, the enemy was drawn upon it, and did capture and destroy it, Congress intended that the damage should be paid out of the public treasury, and not otherwise. This seems to the committee to be the fair and full scope which can be given to these acts as to this class of claims. The testimony in these cases shows that the protection of the tobacco stored in the tobacco warehouse at Tracy's Landing, that tobacco being the private property of the planters in the vicinity, was the object of anxiety to the militia of the surrounding country, that, to accomplish that object, they sent a committee to the governor of the state to solicit from him the use of field pieces, to be used for the defense of that tobacco warehouse, that one field piece was granted to them, and sent with a supply of ammunition for their use, that they pitched upon Town Point as the most eligible position for its location, erected a temporary breastwork between the dwelling houses of Scrivener and Hodson, which are said to have been some 60 yards from each other, and mounted their field piece upon it. At what precise period of the year 1814 these preparations for defense were made does not appear, but the testimony authorizes the supposition that it was before the naval stores had been entirely removed from the tobacco warehouse, and that its occupancy as a depot for naval stores of the United States increased the anxiety carried of the citizens as to the safety of their store and the tobacco lodged in it, is rendered quite probable. Yet it F 272, 1050 not appear that any officer or agent of the United States had any agency in these measures for the defense of Tracy's Landing, from which it is fair to presume that the guard left by Commodore Barney was considered sufficient for the protection of the interests of the United States at that point. As a further measure of defense on the part of the militia, the testimony shows that hogsheads of tobacco were taken by them from the storehouse, and used to construct a temporary breastwork in front of it for the protection of the men who might be stationed there for its defense. After these preparations were made, and while they were making, men from the 3 companies of militia before named, in greater or less numbers, were at the 2 places, and it would seem, as well from the statements in some of the petitions, as from portions of the evidence, that the number of men present at the point and the landing was made to depend very much upon the immediate or remote prospect of danger to the position. When the ENEW carried in his ships or boats, approached so as to seem to threaten an attack, the militia of the neighborhood collected at the 2 points to be ready for his reception, and when he retired, the great body of the guard returned to their labor upon their farms. This seems to have been the sort of force which occupied the positions during the summer and fall of 1814, though the testimony does not show at what time of the year these proceedings commenced, or when they were finally closed. The dwelling houses of Scrivener and Hodson, at Town Point, were abandoned by the families which occupied them, and being thus vacant, were, together with the outbuildings, occupied at pleasure by the militia when there, as was also the tobacco warehouse, and the witnesses state that the men had no tents, and that these buildings contributed to their protection and comfort when upon duty there, and afforded places of deposit for their arms, and the like, when they left upon their temporary absences to attend to their private concerns at home. This is a fair view of the circumstances and manner of use of these buildings, as presented by the testimony in the cases, and the committee can not, for a moment, suppose that such an occupancy, by the militia of this neighborhood, constituted the military forces of the United States or the buildings barracks for the military forces of the United States within the meaning of the Acts of Congress of 1816 and 1817, under consideration. For were these buildings occupied, in the manner described, by an order of an officer or agent of the United States? This inquiry has been already answered, if the committee are right in supposing that the troops by which they were occupied are not military forces of the United States but military forces of the state of Maryland, and that the officers, who ordered them into service and commanded them there, were not officers or agents of the United States but officers or agents of the state of Maryland. In that case there was no officer or agent of the United States to give such an order, and no military forces of the United States to whom he could give it, for it has been already shown that Commodore Barney, when he made the tobacco warehouse a place of deposit for naval stores, put it in charge of a guard from his fleet, and not of this militia force, and that the stores had been removed and the guard withdrawn long before the period spoken of in these papers. There is, it is true, in one of the petty asterisks, and one or two of the depositions, language used of this description. In this deplorable state of things, it was deemed advisable to fortify Town Point, mouth of Tracy's Creek, a most eligible position for the defense of the 11,272 surrounding country, also, for the defense of a large quantity of tobacco deposited in Tracy's Landing Tobacco Inspection Warehouse, and, also, for the protection of a large parcel of the United States military stores deposited in said warehouse by Commodore Barney, belonging to the United States flotilla, which the militia in the neighborhood proudly thought were committed to their charge by Commodore Barney and c. No order to this effect, from Commodore Barney, or any officer of the flotilla, is produced, nor is any such order alleged to have been given, and the language above quoted from one of the petitions, which is as strong as that used by any of the witnesses, forces the inference that no such order was given, as it shows that the idea, in the minds of the militia themselves, that the defense of the naval stores deposited in the tobacco warehouse was devolved upon them, was a mere conclusion, voluntarily drawn, and so far as appears from the mere fact that the stores were there. There was, then, no order of an officer or agent of the United States for the occupation of these buildings, or any of them, by the militia of Maryland. It is worthy of remark, in this place, that no order for the occupation of the buildings by any officer of the militia, or of the state of Maryland, is produced or proved. Indeed, no such order in form is alleged, and there is nothing in the testimony from which such an order is to be inferred, except the fact that commissioned officers of the three companies named, or of some of them, were there, and, with the men, occupied the buildings in the manner before described. The conclusion, therefore, is unavoidable that the buildings were not occupied by an order of an officer or agent of the United States. 5. Did the occupancy of any of the buildings by the United States continue to the time of the destruction? It has been seen that the only building occupied by the United States at all was the tobacco warehouse, and that was occupied not as barracks for the military forces of the United States but as a place of deposit for naval stores, that occupancy was under an order from Commodore Barney, commanding the United States flotilla upon the Chesapeake, and was enforced by a military guard from the fleet, until the stores were withdrawn and the deposit ceased, which must have been at least as early as the destruction of the flotilla, on the 22d of August, 1814, and more than 2 months previous to the attack of the enemy, which resulted in the capture and destruction of the buildings. If, then, the committee have been right in considering the occupancy of these buildings by the militia of the state of Maryland, acting exclusively under the state authority, as not an occupancy by the United States, within the meaning and spirit of the laws of Congress of 1816 and 1817, they are ready to answer this inquiry, that the occupancy of the United States, even of the tobacco warehouse, did not continue up to the time of the destruction, but ceased more than 2 months before that time. 6 was the occupation of the tobacco warehouse by the United States, as a place of deposit for naval stores, the cause of its destruction by the enemy. After what has been said under the previous heads, a very brief reference to a few of the further facts developed by the testimony will furnish a conclusive answer to this inquiry. As nearly as the date can be determined, from all the papers in the cases, the advance of the enemy to the mouth of the creek, and the attack upon, and capture of, the buildings, took place on the 27th of October, 1814, though the question whether the buildings at 272, 12 Town Point were destroyed on that day, or on the subsequent day, when the warehouse was abandoned and burnt, is not made certain from the evidence. All the testimony, however, shows that when the enemy approached within reach of the cannon which had been prepared for service at Town Point, an attack was made upon him from the breastwork there, by the militia in charge of that field piece, and was continued until the men were driven off by his superior force, the gun captured and spiked, and, it is most likely, from all the evidence, the buildings there were then fired and destroyed. The enemy then proceeded up the creek for the tobacco warehouse, his evident object being the capture of the tobacco, and from behind the breastwork of tobacco hogsheads he was attacked, and fired upon there again, until his overwhelming force drove out the militia there stationed, and gave him possession of the warehouse, and the property within it. There he remained, as appears from all the evidence, for some days, occupied in sending the tobacco to his fleet, until General Madison, with a detachment of troops from Virginia, composed of regulars and militia, came to the aid of the Maryland forces, and drove him to his ships. These are the material circumstances attending the destruction of these buildings, and, in the face of them, can there be a doubt as to the cause of the destruction? Was it not palpably the resistance made by the militia to his landing, and possessing himself of the tobacco, the capture of which was the plain object of his attack? And can the credulity of any man suppose that he was drawn on by the consideration that naval stores had been deposited in the warehouse from 2 to 6 months previously, and that a few cannon balls and grape shot, for the use of a flotilla, which he knew had been entirely destroyed more than 2 months before, remained as abandoned property of the United States at that place? The witnesses in these cases do not draw this preposterous inference. They ascribe the destruction of all the buildings to their occupancy by the militia, and the attempts by them to resist the British force, though some of them seem to suppose the enemy might have been drawn to the point by the knowledge that there had been a deposit of military stores in the warehouse. Suppose that to have been the fact, it would offer no reason for the destruction of the buildings at Town Point, nor, if the resistance had not been made, would the finding of a few cannonballs and shot in the storehouse have called for its destruction, noting, as the enemy did well know, that it was private property. And when that building was, in fact, captured from a military force in arms, and actually offering deadly resistance, it is, in the opinion of the committee, asking too much of their credulity, to expect them to conclude that the destruction of the building is to be imputed to the finding of the few abandoned balls and shot within it. They must, therefore, say that the occupancy of this warehouse by Commodore Barney as a place of deposit for naval stores of the United States was not the cause of its destruction, but that the destruction of all the buildings was caused by their occupation by the militia, and the resistance made from them against the landing of the enemy. This conclusion perfectly harmonizes with all the testimony going to show that the officers of the enemy declared that the destruction of the buildings was in consequence of their military occupation, and renders the destruction of the buildings at Town Point as consistent as that of the tobacco warehouse. If the reasoning and conclusions of the committee, upon these points, are sound, it will be seen that no one of the claims provided for in this bill can be sustained upon the general principles established for the allowance of 13,272 claims of this class, in the Acts of 1816 and 1817, so often referred to in this report. Those principles the committee do not think can be safely extended, as general principles applicable to a state of war, and especially as applicable to claims growing out of the War of 1812-15, without the almost certain consequence of manifest injustice to the claimants and the public. The great mass of the claims of this character, arising during that war, have been definitively settled, and finally disposed of, under these laws, and upon these principles, and now to extend the rules of allowance and compensation to those who have voluntarily neglected to avail themselves of the general legislation, and rest upon the sympathy of Congress, applicable to particular cases, would be most manifestly unjust, as a rule between the government and the claimants. It would be to refuse payment to those who come in and made their claims when they should, and to pay those who, in the face of our statute of limitations of 2 years, have delayed to come forward until more than 20 years had elapsed. The danger to the public treasury, in the correct ascertainment of the facts in the respective cases, is not less palpable to the committee, from this late and several action, than the injustice to claimants. The records of the office of the third auditor of the Treasury exhibit, in a most startling manner, the power of time in this aspect of these claims. A reference to a report of his, made upon these very claims, and to be found appended to document number 350, of Senate documents of the first session of the 26th Congress, page 11, will show that a claim for a tobacco warehouse, originally presented to the Commissioner of Claims, under the Act of 1816, and then valued by the owner at $400, and by the witnesses under the commission to take testimony, who were called upon to appraise it, at $450, had risen in 1840, by a regular appraisement, laid before the Committee of Claims of this body, to the respectable value of $2,500. The committee, in disposing of these claims, have not had occasion to take into consideration the valuations presented, because their decision rests upon principles preliminary to the question of value, but it is their duty to say here that the valuations presented are wholly unsatisfactory, if that were a question material with them, that there is in each case but one sum put down for a group of buildings, and that without any description, whatever, of the buildings so valued. They have already remarked that as to one of the claims they find no valuation among the papers, though they find abundant evidence that such papers have been before Congress, and they presume, were it material, they might find them by an inquiry at the clerk's office of the House of Representatives, or of the committee which reported the bill there. These inquiries would have been cheerfully made, if the evidence had been material to the action of the committee. For remarks upon the valuations in these cases they refer to Senate document number 350 of the first session of the 26th Congress, page 13. The committee refer also to the same document for any remarks they might otherwise feel it to be their duty to make in relation to the long delay in the presentation of these claims, from 1814 to 1836. The reasons assigned by the claimants for that delay will be there found, and the remarks of a former committee of the Senate upon their sufficiency. Inasmuch, however, as they seem to rest themselves upon two private acts passed by Congress, both for their delay, and for their demand for the allowance of their claims now, a brief review of those two cases, as presented from the reports of the committees of the House of Representatives upon which the bills were passed, shall close this report. 272-14 The first, in order of time, as the claimants seem to consider it in importance, is the case of James J. Pattison, of Calvert County, Maryland. His claim was presented to the commissioner appointed, under the Act of 1816, and subsequently, to the third auditor of the Treasury, under the Act of 1825, and by the last named officer rejected for the following reason, viz. The buildings are not proved to have been ever occupied in either of the modes mentioned in the law. The testimony taken before the Commissioner was also reported to Congress, and referred to the Committee of Claims, of the House of Representatives, upon which that committee made an unfavorable report, and the claim was rejected by the House in 1818. Afterward, and in 1833, the claimant procured additional testimony and renewed his claim before Congress, and in March, 1836, the Committee of Claims of the House made a favorable report, in pursuance of which the law was passed for the payment of the claim. The committee have not seen the papers in Patterson's case, but from the report last mentioned it appears that the occupancy proved was by a detachment of militia of the state of Maryland, called into service to defend the flotilla of the United States under the command of Commodore Barney, then in the mouth of St. Leonard's Creek, at its junction with the Patuxent, the destruction of which was threatened by the naval and military force acting under the orders of the British commander, Barney. The report does not state by what authority this detachment of militia was called into service, but the service to which it was called was emphatically that of the United States, to defend its naval force upon the waters of the Chesapeake, and in the absence of evidence the presumption is that the call was from the United States authorities. However this may have been, in the emergency, as the militia were called to perform service for the United States, to serve with forces of the United States both naval and military, and to defend a military and naval station of the United States, and the proper tie of the United States at that station, the committee can have no doubt that they were properly considered as a military force of the United States for the time, by whatever authority called out. That point being settled, it appears from the report that the testimony was positive and explicit, as to the order to occupy the buildings, from the major commanding the detachment, and as to the fact of the occupancy, in pursuance of the order, up to the time of the destruction. This is the substance of the case of Patterson, relied upon by these claimants as a precedent for the allowance of their claims, and from this statement of the facts, it cannot fail to be seen that the proofs in these cases do not reach the precedent, either as to the character of the service, the order for the occupancy of the buildings, the manner of that occupancy, or the objects for it. The report referred to in Patterson's case is Doc. Number 406 of Reports of Committees of the House of Representatives, of the first session of the 24th Congress. The other case relied upon as a precedent, is that of the Courthouse of Calvert County, Maryland. This claim, also, was presented to the Commissioner, under the Act of 1816, the testimony taken and reported to Congress, and the claim rejected. It was frequently presented to Congress, and uniformly met unfavorable reports, and, under the Act of 1825, was presented to the third auditor of the Treasury, and was rejected by him for this reason, viz., no proof of a military occupation at the time of destruction. 15. 272-1 in March, 1837, Doc 313. Reports of Committees House of Representatives, 2D Session, 24th Congress. The Committee of Claims made a favorable report upon the claim, and on the 20th of April, 1838, a law was passed for its payment. From this report it appears that this courthouse, for some weeks before its destruction, had been used, by the order of Commodore Barney, as an hospital for the sick and wounded sent from his flotilla, also as a receptacle for some prisoners and their guard, and also as a deposit for naval stores for the use of the flotilla. And here it is proper to remind the Senate that the testimony in these cases shows that a portion of the naval stores originally deposited in the tobacco warehouse at Tracy's Landing were removed to this courthouse, to bring them within convenient reach of the flotilla. The report further shows that at this time several corps of United States troops were at this point, and made their encampment about this courthouse. It is further stated, that, upon the near approach of the enemy on Saturday, Commodore Barney ordered the evacuation of the courthouse by his men stationed in it, and yet that, when the British captured the place, on the Tuesday after, various munitions of war, and other evidences of its military occupation, were found in the building, and drew upon it the destruction, which followed. This is a brief statement of the facts in this case, and the committee, without attempting to pass an opinion upon the propriety or impropriety of the conclusion of the report referred to, cannot find in the case itself any precedent for the allowance of these claims. Then the occupancy, so long as it continued, was an unquestioned occupancy within the principles of the laws of 1816 and 1817, and the destruction was caused thereby, if it was the consequence of any military occupation. Not so here. The occupancy in these cases, which, beyond all doubt, caused the destruction, was either a voluntary occupation by the militia of the neighborhood, or an occupancy solely under state authority, and in either case had for its only object the defense of the buildings and the private property in them, and not any property of the United States. The committee owe it to themselves here to state, that they do not thus examine these two precedents of single private acts, because if they were found to sustain these claims, they should feel bound by them. They cannot admit that great and salutary principles of general legislation for the settlement of classes of claims, and by which hundreds of claims have been settled, are to be considered as ascertained by the allowance of a single private claim by Congress without a strict adherence to them. They know very well that the principles established in the Acts of 1816 and 1817, do not bind Congress, and that it may enlarge and contract them at pleasure, but they do think that the provisions of those acts should be their guide, when claims falling within those provisions are referred to them, until Congress shall choose, either by further general legislation, or by some distinct action in a particular case, to change the rules by which such claims are to be allowed or rejected. And especially, do they believe, this ought to be their course of action, when they entertain the deliberate conviction that the limits prescribed by those acts for the allowance of claims of this character cannot now be enlarged, with reference to claims growing out of the War of 1812-15, with safety to the public treasury, or justice to the claimants, and without unsettling and opening again to legislation all the claims which have been presented under those laws and not paid. The committee are well aware that the conclusion to which they are, 272J16 brought in relation to these claims may be a hard one upon these claimants, and upon all having claims of a similar character, and that consequence they sincerely regret, but they cannot close their eyes to the consequences of an opposite conclusion upon the interests of the whole public. The rule laid down in the laws referred to is, that if the United States, in the prosecution of a war, occupy the buildings of a citizen for military purposes, so as to make them the legitimate object for capture and destruction, according to the rules of civilized warfare, and if, in consequence of such occupancy, the enemy be drawn upon, and do capture and destroy them, the owner shall be compensated out of the public treasury. This is manifestly right, and it is no more than simple justice, under the provision of the Constitution which prohibits the taking of private property for public use without just compensation. The rule which the allowance of these claims would establish, in the opinion of the committee, would be that, if an enemy approach a house, or store, or town, where the United States have no property to defend, and no force for defense, and the citizens of the neighborhood, either voluntarily or under orders from the state authorities, choose to offer military resistance, and thus draw upon their buildings military destruction, the public treasury shall make good the losses, even though they are the admitted consequence of such an unsuccessful attempt at defense, wholly independent of the action of this government. Under such a rule, the safe course of the citizen, in all cases, against those wanton depredations, which are too apt to mark the march of an invading army, would be to make his house his castle, in a strict military sense, and thus secure indemnity from the treasury of the country in case the enemy should choose to destroy it. That such a rule was not prescribed by the Acts of Congress of 1816 and 1817 is most certain, and that its establishment, at any time, would be most dangerous to the national treasury, seemed to the committee as certain. They, therefore, find themselves compelled to report against the allowance of the claims provided for in this bill, and recommend the passage of the following resolution: Resolved, that the bill be indefinitely postponed.